Sometimes the most audacious act of resistance is not to raise a sword, but to wear a disguise so perfect that those who claim to own you look you in the eyes and never see you at all. Before we begin this extraordinary journey of courage and cunning, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss stories like this one that remind us what the human spirit is truly capable of when freedom is at stake. December of 1848. Macon, Georgia. The winter air carried the smell of burning oak and the distant sound of church bells calling the faithful to evening prayer. But in a small cabin on the edge of a sprawling plantation, Ellen Craft sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her mind racing with a plan so dangerous, so impossibly bold, that even thinking it felt like an act of revolution. She was 22 years old, born enslaved, the daughter of an enslaved woman named Maria, and the white man who owned them both. Her fair complexion was the visible reminder of this violence, a mark that set her apart in a world that measured humanity in shades. And now, sitting across from her husband William, she was about to propose something that would either deliver them into freedom or destroy them completely. "I've been thinking," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm in her chest, "about how we might leave this place. Really leave." William looked at his wife, this woman he had married under the stars 3 years ago, with no legal recognition, no protection, only the promise they made to each other that one day they would be free or they would die trying. He was a skilled carpenter, his hands calloused from years of building furniture for people who would never see him as fully human. He had saved every penny he could hide, dreaming of purchasing their freedom, but the price kept rising, always just out of reach. Freedom, he had learned, was not something you could buy from those who never intended to sell it. "What are you thinking?" he asked, though something in her expression told him this was different from all the other conversations they'd had, all the other impossible plans they'd whispered in the dark. Ellen stood and walked to the small mirror hanging on the wall. She studied her reflection, the pale skin that had been both a curse and now, perhaps, the key to their salvation. "I'm thinking that I don't look like what they expect a slave to look like," she said. "I'm thinking that if I cut my hair, if I dressed in men's clothing, if I wrapped my face and pretended to be ill, I could pass for a young white man traveling with his slave. I could be the master. You could be my property, and we could walk right past them, through them, all the way to freedom." The silence that followed was deafening. William stood slowly, processing what she had just said. It was audacious, it was terrifying, it was genius. The very idea of it could get them killed. But staying here, living this half-life, watching their future children be born into chains, that was a kind of death too. A slower one, a more certain one. "They would have to believe it completely," William said, his mind already working through the logistics. "One mistake, one moment where they see through the disguise. Then we hang," Ellen finished. "But William, we're dying here anyway, just slower. At least this way we die reaching for something." Outside, the December wind rattled the shutters. Somewhere in the distance, an overseer shouted orders, his voice carrying across the fields where people who looked like Ellen and William worked from sunrise to sunset, their lives measured in harvests and market prices. This was the world they knew, the only world they had ever known. But it was not the only world that existed. Over the next 2 weeks, they began to prepare. William used his carpentry skills to build a small case, the kind a wealthy traveler might carry. Ellen began binding her right arm, practicing holding it in a sling as if injured, a clever excuse for why this young master could not sign his own name in hotel registries or travel documents. She practiced walking like a man, shoulders back, stride confident, voice deeper. She practiced looking through people instead of at them, the way white men looked at slaves, as if they were furniture or livestock. It made her sick to practice this cruelty, but she knew survival depended on becoming invisible, by becoming visible in a different way. They saved every cent William could earn from extra carpentry jobs. They would need money for train tickets, for hotels, for bribes if necessary. They calculated distances, studied maps they glimpsed in their master's house, memorized the names of cities they had never seen. Savannah, Charleston, Richmond, Baltimore, Philadelphia. Philadelphia. The very word sounded like a prayer. The city of brotherly love, where slavery did not exist, where they could walk down the street as husband and wife, as human beings as themselves. But first, they had to become someone else entirely. The night before their departure, Ellen sat with scissors in her hand, looking at her reflection one last time. Her hair had been long, beautiful, one of the few things she could control about her appearance. Now she would cut it short, transform herself into something unrecognizable. William stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to do this," he said, though they both knew there was no other way. "Yes, I do," Ellen replied. "For us. For every child we might have, for every person still trapped in these chains." She made the first cut. Hair fell like dark rain around her feet, and with each snip of the scissors, Ellen Craft began to disappear, replaced by someone new, someone dangerous, someone free. She wrapped her face with cloth, mimicking the poultices wealthy people used for toothaches. She put on the glasses William had acquired, tinted lenses that would hide her eyes. She dressed in the fine suit they had somehow managed to obtain, fabric that smelled of privilege and power. She looked in the mirror and saw a stranger, a young white man of means, slightly ill perhaps, but clearly someone who belonged to the world of movement and choice. William looked at his wife and felt a strange combination of pride and terror. She was magnificent. She was unrecognizable. She was the most courageous person he had ever known. "What should I call you?" he asked. "What name will you take?" Ellen thought for a moment. "Mr. Johnson," she said. "I'll be Mr. William Johnson, traveling north for medical treatment." And so, on December 21st, 1848, as the sun rose over Macon, Georgia, two enslaved people walked toward the train station as master and slave. Ellen Craft became Mr. Johnson, and William became the property of this fictional white man. They carried with them nothing but a small bag, some money hidden in William's clothing, and a plan so audacious that its success depended entirely on the willingness of white people to see exactly what they expected to see and nothing more. The train station was crowded with travelers preparing for the Christmas holiday. Families embraced, children ran between luggage, men in fine coats discussed business and politics. Ellen walked through this crowd with her head high, her arm in its sling, her face partially wrapped, and not a single person questioned her presence. She was exactly what they expected to see, a young Southern gentleman of means. William walked 3 steps behind her, carrying the bag, his eyes down, playing the role of the dutiful slave with a performance that came from years of survival. But inside, his heart was hammering so hard, he was certain everyone could hear it. At the ticket window, Ellen's first test arrived. The clerk looked at her expectantly. "Destination? Philadelphia," Ellen said, her voice low and steady, practicing the accent she had heard white men use her entire life. "Via Savannah, Charleston, and Richmond. I require accommodations befitting my station. My slave will attend to my needs during the journey." The clerk nodded, barely looking at her, already reaching for the tickets. This was how power worked, Ellen realized. When you wore it confidently enough, people simply accepted it. They never looked beneath the surface because they had no reason to doubt what they saw. Money exchanged hands, tickets were issued, and just like that, Ellen and William Craft began their impossible journey north. The first leg of the trip, from Macon to Savannah, passed in a blur of terror disguised as calm. Ellen sat in the first-class car, surrounded by white men who discussed politics and cotton prices, who complained about the difficulties of managing slaves, who never once suspected that the slight young man beside them was herself enslaved, herself the property they spoke about so casually. She kept her responses minimal, citing her illness as a reason for silence, and the men around her accepted this without question. William rode in the slave car, cramped and uncomfortable, but he had ridden in worse. What terrified him was not his own discomfort, but the knowledge that at any moment someone might recognize them. Someone might remember seeing Ellen as herself, as a slave woman in Macon. Someone might notice the way Mr. Johnson held himself, the way his hands moved, the slight tremor in his voice when he spoke. But the miles passed, and no one noticed. The train carried them east toward Savannah, each rotation of the wheels taking them further from bondage and closer to a freedom they had only imagined. In Savannah they faced their next trial. They needed to book passage on a steamship to Charleston. This meant interacting with more ticket agents, more scrutiny, more opportunities for the disguise to fail. Ellen approached the desk with her characteristic confidence, but inside she was calculating every gesture, every word. "I need 2 passages to Charleston," she said. "One for myself, first class, and one for my boy." The agent looked up, his eyes scanning Ellen's face, the wrapped jaw, the tinted glasses, the fine clothing. For one terrible moment Ellen thought he saw through everything, but then he simply nodded and began filling out the paperwork. Name? William Johnson. Occupation? Planter, traveling for medical treatment. The agent made notes, and Ellen's heart continued its dangerous rhythm. Each lie stacked upon the previous one, building a house of cards that could collapse with a single wrong word. They boarded the steamship that evening. The vessel was grand, far grander than anything Ellen had ever experienced. She was shown to a private cabin, while William was directed to the lower decks, where enslaved people traveling with their masters were kept. Being separated was terrifying, but they had anticipated this. They had planned for every contingency they could imagine. What they had not planned for was the man who sat down beside Ellen in the dining room that evening. He was older, well-dressed, with the confident manner of someone who had owned other human beings his entire life. He introduced himself as Mr. Cray, a planter from South Carolina, and he was immediately interested in this young Mr. Johnson traveling alone with only one slave. "Terrible business traveling when you're unwell," Mr. Cray said, gesturing to Ellen's rapt face. "What ails you, if you don't mind my asking?" "Rheumatism," Ellen replied, using the illness they had chosen specifically because it was vague enough to explain discomfort without inviting too much medical scrutiny. "My physician recommended northern specialists." "Ah, yes. The cold climate can be beneficial, though I can't imagine leaving South Carolina for any extended period. Tell me, where are your people from?" This was dangerous territory. Any specific claim about family or plantation could be verified, checked, investigated. Ellen had to be vague enough to avoid detection, but specific enough to be believed. "Macon, Georgia," she said. "Though I confess the journey has exhausted me. I hope you'll forgive me if I retire early this evening." Mr. Cray nodded sympathetically, but he was not finished. "Tell me, Mr. Johnson, what do you think of this growing abolitionist nonsense in the North? I hear they're becoming quite bold, these people who would destroy our way of life." Ellen felt ice in her veins. Here, surrounded by the luxury purchased with the labor of people who looked like her, she was being asked to condemn those who fought for her freedom. Every instinct screamed to reveal herself, to shout the truth, to tear off the disguise and declare her humanity. Instead, she took a slow breath and said, "I believe every man should have the right to his property, as guaranteed by law and custom." The words tasted like poison, but they satisfied Mr. Cray. He smiled, nodded, and launched into a lengthy discourse about the natural order of society and the divine justification for slavery. Ellen sat through it, her face impassive, her mind screaming, her soul carefully locked away where these words could not touch it. When she finally escaped to her cabin, She collapsed against the door, her whole body shaking. This was the cost of freedom, she realized, not just the fear of being caught, but the moral compromise of playing the role so well that it wounded her own spirit. She thought of William, somewhere below decks, surrounded by people who believed him to be what the world had labeled him. She thought of all the others still trapped, still suffering, and she promised herself that if they made it to freedom, she would spend the rest of her life fighting to tear down this entire evil system. But first, they had to survive. The journey from Savannah to Charleston took most of the night. Ellen barely slept, her mind running through everything that could go wrong. In Charleston, they would need to board another train. More ticket agents, more scrutiny, more opportunities for disaster. When they arrived at Charleston Harbor in the early morning light, William met her on the deck. For just a moment their eyes connected, and in that glance they communicated everything they could not say aloud. Stay strong. Keep going. We're almost there. The Charleston train station was massive, crowded with holiday travelers and slaves loading luggage onto trains. Ellen and William navigated through the chaos, Ellen maintaining her imperious distance while William played his role with devastating accuracy. They were so close now. Charleston to Richmond, Richmond to Baltimore, Baltimore to Philadelphia. Each leg of the journey brought them closer to freedom, but also closer to the moment when their luck might run out. At the ticket counter, Ellen purchased their passage north, and once again, no one questioned her. The transformation was so complete, the performance so perfect, that the very people who enslaved others could not see through the disguise. It was a testament to the power of expectation, the way people saw what they wanted to see rather than what was really there. But as they were boarding the train, a voice called out behind them. "Mr. Johnson, a moment, please." Ellen turned, her heart stopping, to see a military officer approaching with quick steps. He was young, perhaps 30, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Behind him, 2 enlisted men waited, their faces curious. "Yes?" Ellen said, her voice steady despite the terror flooding through her. "I couldn't help but notice your slave," the officer said, gesturing toward William. "Fine-looking fellow, strong build. I'm wondering if you might be interested in selling him. I'm in need of a good carpenter, and I'm prepared to offer a generous price." Of all the scenarios they had imagined, this was not one of them. Someone wanted to buy William. Someone wanted to separate them right here, right now, when they were so close to freedom. Ellen felt the world tilting, but she forced her voice to remain calm. "My boy is not for sale, sir. He is quite indispensable to me, particularly given my current ill health." The officer frowned, clearly disappointed. "I understand, Mr. Johnson, but I must insist that you at least consider my offer, $500. That's well above market value for a slave his age and condition." $500. Ellen thought of all the times she had heard human beings reduced to prices, to market values, to transactions. She thought of her mother, sold away when Ellen was just a child. She thought of all the families torn apart, all the love destroyed, all in the name of profit. "He is not for sale at any price," Ellen said firmly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I must board before the train departs." The officer stepped closer, his expression hardening. "I don't think you understand, Mr. Johnson. In these parts, when a military officer expresses interest in property, it's considered poor form to refuse without at least a proper negotiation." This was it. The moment where everything could fall apart. Ellen could feel William behind her, could sense his tension, his readiness to fight if necessary, even though they both knew fighting would mean certain death. They were trapped between maintaining the disguise and refusing to be separated, and there was no good answer. Ellen straightened her shoulders and looked the officer directly in the eyes. "Sir," she said, her voice cold and aristocratic, channeling every ounce of privilege she had ever observed in white men. "I am a gentleman of means traveling for my health. My slave is my property, legally purchased and registered in Macon, Georgia. Unless you have legal authority to confiscate private property without cause, I must insist that you allow me to continue my journey. I have influential connections in both Georgia and Virginia who would take a dim view of any harassment. It was a gamble, invoking unnamed powerful friends, but it was all she had. The officer studied her face, and Ellen could see him weighing his options, calculating whether this young man was worth the potential trouble. Finally, he stepped back. "Very well, Mr. Johnson. My apologies for the inconvenience. Safe travels." Ellen nodded curtly and turned toward the train, her legs somehow still carrying her forward, even though every muscle wanted to collapse. William followed, and they boarded the train car just as the whistle blew. They had survived another test, but Ellen knew the memory of that moment would haunt her forever. The casual way the officer had tried to buy William, the ease with which he would have destroyed their lives, reminded her that this journey was not just about their freedom, but about the fundamental evil of a system that allowed such transactions to exist. The train pulled out of Charleston, carrying them north through the Carolina winter landscape. Ellen sat in the first-class car, surrounded once again by white passengers who discussed weather and politics, and never suspected that the young man beside them was fighting for his life with every breath. William rode in the slave car, enduring the cramped conditions and the contemptuous treatment, but he too understood that each mile brought them closer to their goal. Richmond was their next major stop, and here they faced what would become their greatest challenge yet. The city was a hub of the slave trade, filled with traders and overseers who made their living trafficking in human flesh. The train station was crowded, chaotic, and dangerous in ways that Macon and Charleston had not been. This was enemy territory in its purest form. Ellen and William disembarked carefully, maintaining their roles even as they scanned the crowd for threats. They needed to secure tickets for the final leg to Baltimore, and from there to Philadelphia. They were so close, just 2 more cities, just 2 more tests. But as Ellen approached the ticket counter, a man stepped into her path. He was thin, sharp-faced, with eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He wore the clothes of a merchant, but there was something predatory in his manner that made Ellen's blood run cold. "Pardon me," the man said, his voice smooth as oil, "but I couldn't help noticing you and your slave. I'm in the business of verifying travel documents for suspicious persons. It's my civic duty, you understand. These are dangerous times with abolitionists helping slaves escape. I'm sure you understand the necessity of caution." Ellen's mind raced. This was it. This was the moment they had feared. A slave catcher. Someone whose entire purpose was to identify escaped slaves and return them to bondage. Someone who was trained to see through disguises, to notice the small details that others missed. "I have my documents in order," Ellen said, her voice steady even as her hands trembled inside her gloves. "I'm a gentleman traveler, nothing more." The man smiled, but it was not a friendly expression. "I'm sure you are, sir. But you understand we must be thorough. Would you mind showing me your travel papers, and perhaps the bill of sale for your slave?" A bill of sale. The one document they did not have, could not have, because William had never been legally sold to the fictional Mr. Johnson. This was the trap. This was how the disguise would fail. Ellen felt time slowing down. She could see William in her peripheral vision, tensed and ready. She could see other passengers watching this confrontation with mild curiosity. She could see the future collapsing, could see chains and whips and separation, could see everything they had risked being torn away in this single moment. And then, from behind the suspicious man, another voice spoke. "Is there some problem here?" Ellen turned to see an older gentleman, well-dressed and obviously wealthy, watching the confrontation with interest. He had kind eyes, the sort of face that suggested he had lived long enough to see many things, and had perhaps developed some wisdom from the experience. The suspicious man straightened. "Just routine verification, sir, making sure all property is properly documented." The older gentleman stepped closer, studying Ellen with careful attention. Ellen's heart hammered. Another witness, another potential threat. But then the old man spoke again. "Mr. Johnson and I traveled together from Savannah." He lied smoothly, though Ellen had never seen him before. "I can personally vouch for his character and the legitimacy of his travel. Unless you have specific cause for suspicion beyond general paranoia, I suggest you allow this young man to continue his journey. He is clearly unwell and in need of medical attention." The suspicious man hesitated, caught between his instincts and the social pressure of contradicting another white man of obvious status. In the hierarchy of Southern society, the word of a gentleman carried weight, and to challenge it without concrete evidence was to risk social censure. "I meant no offense," the man finally said, backing down but with obvious reluctance. "These are merely precautions." "Understood," the older gentleman said. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a train to catch." He gestured for Ellen to follow him, and they walked together toward the ticket counter, leaving the suspicious man behind. William followed at an appropriate distance, still playing his role even though Ellen could see the relief in the set of his shoulders. At the counter, the older gentleman purchased his own ticket, then turned to Ellen. "I hope you'll forgive my presumption, Mr. Johnson," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only Ellen could hear. "But I've seen that man question too many travelers, and I find his methods distasteful. Safe travels to you." He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Ellen standing there with questions she could never ask. Did he know? Had he seen through the disguise? Or was he simply a decent person who objected to the harassment of travelers? Ellen would never know. But in that moment, she understood that even in the heart of slave territory, there were those who chose kindness over cruelty, who chose to help rather than harm. It gave her hope. The train to Baltimore departed on schedule, and Ellen and William settled into their respective cars for what they prayed would be the penultimate leg of their journey. They were exhausted now, physically and emotionally drained from days of maintaining the disguise, of living in constant fear of discovery. But they could not afford to relax. Not yet. Baltimore was a border city, right on the line between slave states and free states, and it was known as a place where slave catchers operated with impunity, where the Fugitive Slave Act was enforced with brutal efficiency. Ellen sat in her first-class seat, watching the winter landscape pass by outside the window. Fields of dormant crops, small towns with church steeples rising above bare trees. The land itself looked no different here than it had in Georgia, but Ellen knew that lines existed, invisible boundaries drawn on maps and in laws that determined whether a person was property or free. They were approaching that line now, approaching the moment when they would cross from one world into another. But first, they had to survive Baltimore. The city appeared on the horizon at dusk, its buildings silhouetted against the winter sky. Gas lamps were being lit along the streets, casting pools of yellow light into the gathering darkness. The train slowed, brakes squealing, and pulled into the station with a hiss of steam and a final lurch. Ellen disembarked carefully, her body stiff from hours of sitting in the same position, maintaining the same posture. William appeared beside her, carrying their bag, and together they made their way through the crowded platform. They needed to find the train to Philadelphia. Just one more journey, just one more performance, just one more day of being someone they were not. But as they approached the ticket window, Ellen noticed something that made her blood freeze. Police officers. Multiple police officers stationed throughout the station, watching travelers with careful attention, and among them, men in civilian clothes who had the unmistakable bearing of slave catchers, their eyes scanning every face, looking for the subtle tells that distinguished the enslaved from the free. Ellen kept walking, kept her head high, kept her shoulders back. She was Mr. Johnson. She was a white gentleman. She belonged here. She had nothing to fear. But inside, she was terrified. At the ticket counter, she purchased 2 tickets to Philadelphia, her voice steady, her hands hidden in her gloves so no one could see them shaking. The clerk processed the transaction without comment, and Ellen took the tickets with a curt nod of thanks. They were so close. Just one more train ride. Just a few more hours. But then, as they turned toward the platform, one of the police officers stepped into their path. "Excuse me, sir," the officer said, his voice polite but firm. "I need to ask you a few questions." Ellen's world tilted. This was it. This was the end. After everything they had survived, every obstacle they had overcome, they were going to be caught here in Baltimore, just hours from freedom. "Yes, officer?" Ellen said, her voice carefully controlled. "We've received reports of escaped slaves attempting to flee north disguised as travelers. I'm sure you understand we need to be vigilant. May I see your papers?" Ellen reached into her coat pocket with her good hand, her other arm still in its sling. She withdrew the tickets she had just purchased, along with some other documents William had managed to forge, basic letters of introduction that might pass casual inspection. The officer studied them, his eyes moving from the papers to Ellen's face and back again. Ellen could see him thinking, calculating, trying to find any reason to doubt what he saw. Behind him, other officers were watching. Behind them, the train to Philadelphia sat waiting, steam rising from its engine, freedom so close Ellen could almost touch it. "These seem in order," the officer finally said, but he did not hand the papers back. "But I'm going to need to ask you about your slave. Has he been with you long?" "Several years," Ellen said. "He's quite loyal. I would be lost without him, especially given my illness." "And you have documentation of ownership?" This was the trap again. The question they could not answer honestly. Ellen felt William beside her, felt his presence, his strength, his absolute faith that they would find a way through this. "Officer," Ellen said, drawing herself up to her full height and channeling every ounce of aristocratic indignation she could muster. "I am a gentleman traveling for my health, and I find this interrogation both insulting and unnecessary. I have shown you my documents. I have answered your questions. If you have specific evidence of wrongdoing, then present it. Otherwise, I must insist that you allow me to board my train. I have important medical appointments in Philadelphia, and any delay could have serious consequences for my health." It was a gamble, this tone of command. But Ellen had learned during this journey that confidence was its own kind of credential. The officer hesitated, clearly torn between his suspicions and the social expectation that he defer to a gentleman of means. "I meant no offense, sir," the officer finally said, handing back the papers. "We're simply doing our duty. Safe travels to you." Ellen nodded curtly and brushed past him, William following, and they boarded the train with seconds to spare before departure. As the train pulled out of Baltimore Station, carrying them north toward Pennsylvania, toward freedom, Ellen finally allowed herself to breathe. They had done it. They had passed every test. They had looked their oppressors in the eyes and walked past them. They had claimed their humanity through an act of such audacious courage that it seemed impossible even now, even as it was happening. The train carried them through the winter night, and Ellen sat in her first-class seat, watching the darkness outside the window. Somewhere in that darkness was the Maryland-Pennsylvania border. Somewhere in that darkness was the invisible line that separated slave from free. And they were about to cross it. When the train finally crossed into Pennsylvania in the early hours of the morning, Ellen felt something break open inside her chest. It was not joy. Not yet. It was too complicated for joy, too mixed with grief for all those still trapped in bondage, too tangled with trauma from the journey they had just survived. But it was something, a crack in the wall, a possibility, a beginning. William found her after the train pulled into Philadelphia's station just after dawn. They were still playing their roles, still master and slave for the eyes of the world. But when their eyes met, they both knew. They were free. They were actually free. They made their way to the offices of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, where abolitionists helped escaped slaves find shelter and safety. When they finally closed the door behind them and knew they were among friends, Ellen removed the disguise. She unwrapped her face. She took off the glasses. She let down what was left of her hair. And she wept. William held her, and they cried together. 4 days of terror and tension finally released in great shaking sobs. They had survived. They had escaped. They had claimed their freedom through an act of imagination and courage so profound that it would echo through history. In the days that followed, Ellen and William told their story to the abolitionists who had welcomed them. They described the journey, the disguise, the close calls, and narrow escapes. Their story spread quickly through abolitionist networks, inspiring others who were trapped in bondage, giving hope to those who thought escape was impossible. But Ellen and William also learned that their freedom was fragile. The Fugitive Slave Act meant that even in Pennsylvania, they could be captured and returned to slavery. Their former masters, learning of their escape, put significant resources into trying to recapture them. Ellen and William had to flee again, this time to Boston, and eventually to England, where they lived in exile for nearly 20 years before it was safe to return to America. During those years abroad, Ellen became a powerful voice in the abolitionist movement. She spoke at rallies and wrote about her experiences. She helped other escaped slaves find freedom. She never forgot the terror of those 4 days in December 1848, but she also never forgot the lesson it taught her, that the oppressed are not powerless, that resistance takes many forms, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply to insist on your own humanity in a world designed to deny it. Years later, after the Civil War had ended and slavery had been abolished, Ellen and William returned to America. They settled in Georgia, near where their impossible journey had begun, and they bought land, started a farm, and helped formerly enslaved people build new lives in freedom. Ellen would sometimes stand in the fields of their farm, looking south toward Macon, remembering the woman she had been, the disguise she had worn, the extraordinary courage it had taken to claim her freedom. She thought about all the people who had never escaped, who had died in bondage, whose stories would never be told. She thought about the systemic evil that had required such desperate measures, that had forced her to pretend to be a white man just to travel as a free person. And she dedicated her life to ensuring that future generations would know not just the cruelty of slavery, but the resistance, the courage, the incredible ingenuity of those who fought against it. Ellen Craft's story is one of thousands, millions of stories of resistance from the era of slavery. Some fought with weapons. Some fought through subtle sabotage. Some fought through escape, through education, through survival itself. Each story is a testament to the unbreakable human spirit, to the drive for freedom that cannot be fully suppressed, no matter how brutal the oppression. Today, when we tell Ellen's story, we honor not just her courage, but the courage of all who resisted. We acknowledge that the fight for freedom is not a single dramatic gesture, but a sustained effort that takes creativity, intelligence, and an absolute refusal to accept dehumanization. Ellen's disguise was perfect, but what made it work was not the clothes or the glasses or the wrapped face. What made it work was her absolute belief that she deserved to be free, that she was fully human, that no law or custom or violence could change that fundamental truth. Her journey from Macon to Philadelphia took 4 days. Her journey from enslaved woman to free citizen took a lifetime. But in between, in those terrifying, exhilarating hours on trains and steamships, wearing a disguise that allowed her to hide in plain sight, Ellen Craft proved something essential. That the oppressed see their oppressors with perfect clarity, understand the system better than those who benefit from it, and possess resources of courage and creativity that those in power can never fully suppress. When we remember Ellen, we remember all those who resisted. We remember all those who died fighting. We remember all those who survived and built lives of dignity in the aftermath of trauma. We remember that freedom is not given but taken, not granted but claimed, not passive but active. And we remember that the human spirit, when faced with the choice between accepting chains or risking everything for freedom, will choose freedom every time. Because that is what it means to be human. That is what they could never take away, no matter how they tried. Ellen Craft lived until 1891, 43 years after her escape. She saw slavery ended. She saw Reconstruction rise and fall. She saw the beginning of a new kind of oppression that would take different forms but spring from the same root of racism and dehumanization. She never stopped fighting. She never stopped telling her story. She never stopped insisting that every person, regardless of the color of their skin, deserved dignity, respect, and freedom. Her legacy lives on in every person who refuses to accept oppression, who uses creativity and courage to resist injustice, who risks everything for the fundamental human right to self-determination. Her story reminds us that heroes are not just those who fight with swords, but those who fight with intelligence, who turn the oppressor's assumptions against them, who see the weak points in seemingly impenetrable systems and exploit them with devastating effectiveness. Ellen Craft was a master of disguise, yes, but she was also a master of dignity, of courage, of the kind of moral clarity that comes from experiencing injustice and refusing to be broken by it. She looked at the institution of slavery, at the entire apparatus of laws and customs and violence that supported it, and she found a way through. Not around. Not over. Through. By becoming what they never expected, by hiding in the one place they would never look, by transforming herself into their blind spot. That is genius. That is courage. That is resistance in its purest, most beautiful form. When we tell Ellen's story to future generations, we must tell all of it. The terror and the triumph. The moral compromises required to maintain the disguise and the absolute moral clarity of the goal. The narrow escapes and the people who helped along the way. The years of exile and the eventual return home. The entire arc of a life dedicated to freedom. Because Ellen Craft's story is not just a historical curiosity or an inspiring tale, it is a roadmap. A testament to what is possible when people refuse to accept their oppression. A reminder that systems of dehumanization are maintained through assumptions and expectations, and that when we challenge those assumptions, when we refuse to meet those expectations, we create cracks in the foundation of tyranny. Today, nearly 2 centuries after Ellen's escape, we live in a world still grappling with the legacy of slavery, still fighting against racism and discrimination, still working toward the kind of genuine equality and dignity that Ellen risked her life to claim. Her story matters not just as history, but as inspiration, as guidance, as proof that change is possible when people are willing to risk everything for it. So we remember Ellen Craft, the woman who disguised herself as a white master to escape slavery. We remember her courage, her intelligence, her absolute refusal to accept the role society had assigned her. We remember the 4 days in December 1848 when she walked through the heart of slave territory and no one saw her because she had transformed herself into something they could not imagine. And we carry forward her legacy by continuing the fight she began, by insisting on dignity and equality for all people, by refusing to accept injustice in any form, by using our creativity and intelligence and courage to resist oppression wherever we find it. Ellen Craft's journey did not end when she reached Philadelphia. It did not end when slavery was abolished. It continues in every person who fights for freedom, who refuses to accept dehumanization, who looks at injustice and says, "Not anymore, not ever again." That is her gift to us. That is her legacy. That is why we tell her story, why we must keep telling her story, why her courage and intelligence and absolute humanity must never be forgotten. Because in the end, Ellen Craft did not just escape slavery. She proved it was escapable. She showed that the system, for all its violence and power, had weaknesses. She demonstrated that the oppressed possess resources the oppressors can never fully control: imagination, courage, and an unbreakable commitment to freedom. And that truth, once proven, can never be unproven. That example once set can never be erased. That courage once demonstrated echoes through history, inspiring generations yet to come. Ellen Craft, the enslaved woman who disguised herself as a white master to escape capture, who risked everything for freedom, who survived and thrived and spent her life fighting for others to be free, who showed us all what true courage looks like. Her story is not just history, it is prophecy. It tells us what is possible when we refuse to accept oppression, when we use our intelligence and creativity to resist tyranny, when we insist on our own humanity no matter what the cost. Remember her name. Remember her courage. Remember her story. And carry forward the work she began, the fight for a world where no one needs to disguise themselves to be free, where every person is recognized as fully human, where dignity is not something to be earned or claimed, but something inherent in every human soul. That is Ellen Craft's legacy. That is what she risked her life to achieve. And that is why, nearly 2 centuries later, her story still matters, still inspires, still teaches us what it means to be truly free.